What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 168. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, joined by the co-host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
I'm doing great, Kyle. I'm glad to be back. How you doing?
Doing good and happy to have you back on. We got a lot to cover today, a lot of important stories. Of course, as always, updating any kind of news that comes out on Assange, and there's a big story about him today. COVID news, spending in Congress. AOC is generating a lot of headlines about foreign policy, so we're talking about her. A whole bunch of important stuff, so to be sure to share today's show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. You can find the show on YouTube, Odyssey, or Rumble. Just be sure that you're subscribing, you're liking, giving it a rumble or a thumbs up, and hitting the share button, because that is what helps to grow the show and get it out there to new listeners. We're not saying the kind of thing that the establishment wants to hear, so we're not going to get any help from like the algorithms or the mainstream. It's going to be on our listeners to push our show, and we really appreciate when you all do that. We also post the show and clips from each show on our social media accounts, Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. And then you can support the show and give us money, Patreon or Subscribestar, or there's crypto information in the show notes page. The last thing you could do to support the show, and this way you get some great benefits for yourself, and that is doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com, and the promo code is PEACE. Will, I really like their topicals, and I'm talking about them all the time on the show, but I know you got some other favorites, so what have you been using from Paloma Verde?
Yeah, they've got all kinds of stuff. I think they even have stuff for like your pets and stuff. But my personal favorites are the soft gels. They have a couple different kinds. They have curcumin, which I think helps people with like inflammation and stuff. But my personal pick is the melatonin soft gels. Those help you, kind of wind down, get to sleep at night. I have some issues with insomnia. Also, their high dose oil tincture. That's, to me, if you just want the biggest dose of CBD you can get at once, that's what you go with. So those are the things I would recommend. But if people are curious about CBD, Paloma Verde has all kind of educational resources. They have their lab results, so you can see that you are getting indeed what they say you're getting. It's not like Kyle says, some kind of gas station gummy worm or something. So if that sounds interesting to you, go to palomaverdecbd.com and use the promo code PEACE.
All right.
So yeah, just to, I think, jump right into our first story here. I actually had not seen this today. You had mentioned this to me off air, and you mentioned it in your intro, but there is a pretty big story out. There's some new reporting that suggests the CIA may have wanted to kidnap Julian Assange at some point. I guess the idea doesn't sound too shocking given what we know about the CIA as an organization, but please tell us all about this. What's this story saying?
Yeah, well, so, just to get into it from the start, because this is being talked about a lot in independent media today, and there's a lot of high praise for this article. It's titled Kidnapping, Assassination, and London Shootout Inside the CIA's Secret War Plans Against WikiLeaks, and it's co-authored by Zach Dorfman, Sean Naylor, and Michael Iskoff. A lot of people are referring to this as the Michael Iskoff article, as he is the biggest name on it, but it is worth noting that typically bylines do go in order of contribution, and so he would be, of the three, the least contributing to this article. Nonetheless, I'm sure he did have a role in crafting and everything like that, but I just wanted to mention that because everybody is just kind of offhand calling it the Iskoff article. And so there's a lot of important things in this article, Will, and of course we maybe could spend a whole show breaking it down, but I don't actually think that's necessary, because a lot of what's reported in this article are things that have already been reported either in the international or independent media. And so, and of course, it coming from these sources within, I think in this article, they cite something 30 different CIA or other senior intelligence officials. And so it's certainly coming from, the most official sources these stories have come from. But nonetheless, it has been reported in the past, like the role of UC Global in spying on Julian Assange. And there have been talks about the potential that they were plotting or talking about assassinating Assange by poison or potentially kidnapping him. Now that the CIA was at some of the things that the CIA was discussing here, I have not heard before. And those are the more sensational details of this story. And these aren't mainstream sources. This is Michael Iskoff likely talking to his CIA insider sources, right? And likely
Right.
the other reporters at Yahoo doing similar things. And so that, we should be skeptical of some of this. Like, how far did it really go when the CIA was? So I guess I should get into the story in more detail. Apparently, in like late 2016, once the WikiLeaks released the DNC emails. Apparently, Obama kind of let the CIA take their gloves off when it came to WikiLeaks and start to really infiltrate the organization. They discussed that as they start to spy on the different members, they found that there were a lot of personality differences and a lot of people didn't like other people. And so one of the things that the CIA wanted to do is like essentially subterfuge and like, say like, oh, so-and-so said that you're a bad person or whatever and pass that along to just try to destroy the WikiLeaks network. I guess
Right.
it didn't go very far, or who actually knows, maybe it did. But at least I'm not aware of like anything to say that this was effective at all. But I did want to point out to any libertarians or really anybody in the independent circle listening, it is something to pay attention to, that the CIA will do something like this to try to destroy an organization that it considers a threat. They will, basically use internal gossip to make problems within that movement bigger and to amplify a discord. And
Yeah.
so, just something to be aware of. Anyways, one of the things that was discussed in the late Obama administration was relabeling some journalists, and particularly WikiLeaks, and rather as information brokers and not journalists. And well, the reason this is important is not just because this is a crazy amount of newspeak, but because it would essentially circumvent the First Amendment for all these people. And
Right.
so that's one of the reasons that this is important. Now, I want to point out something in the article. I feel like anything that is bad about Obama on the First Amendment, or Obama being the president that used the espionage at the most, all that is kind of downplayed in the article, and really all the where it's most sensational, the writing, it's in reflection of like Pompeo and Trump and what we're getting to now. And so they say that after the Trump administration takes over, Mike Pompeo becomes director of the CIA. And at the time, well, me and you were warning about this label of the hostile intelligence agency, right? That
Yeah.
Pompeo was talking about and applying. And so apparently what happened is after WikiLeaks dropped the Vault 7, the CIA was so, and Pompeo himself particularly, was so embarrassed that, and there's weird things in this article, Will, like it says that Pompeo was so embarrassed by this, he would try not to tell Trump about it. Like it wasn't front page news and he wasn't going to find out. And so like there are things in this article that made me skeptical of some of the reporting, something like that.
Right.
But anyways, it's a report that he was so upset that he did label WikiLeaks a hostile intelligence agency, which allowed the CIA to bypass some, I don't know. It's really hard to call them like restrictions on what the CIA could do, but maybe a little bit government bureaucracy, like having to inform the congressional oversight committees, or at least the Gang of Eight in Congress, on the
Right.
plan, having to get a finding. This is like an official document from the president to move forward. They would be able to do this. And the problem is that they couldn't tie WikiLeaks to Russia. Now, you had to kind of read between the lines in the story to get this, but they couldn't tie WikiLeaks to Russia, and so they declared them a hostile intelligence agency in order to still be able to carry out offensive intelligence operations against WikiLeaks, right? Then some of the things that they considered doing to Assange during this time are kidnapping, where they were hiring somebody to leave the door open and then they would go in and kidnap him. They talked about potentially just assassination assassinating him. I think poisoning was the thing. I don't think they were looking to actually kill him. They talked about the dangers of or the possibility of actually getting into a shootout on the streets of London. And this is because at this time, I'm not sure, Will, this is really confusing to me. If there's actually any evidence to this, if it's maybe just the CIA trying to slander Assange's name right here and to throw out this like made up story, or if maybe it was CIA paranoia. But I don't think there's any reason to believe this is actually true. But according to the reporting here, the CIA believed that Russia was going to take Assange in and that, they were somehow going to smuggle him out of the embassy. Now, okay. One of the reasons that I am very skeptical of this is that in this story, it says essentially that they are going to do like they did with Snowden, which we know is not the case at all, that Snowden actually got stranded in Russia intentionally by the Obama administration and has since been admitted by Ben Rhodes in his new book. It is, this is flat fact. You can't deny that this is what they did intentionally by stranding Snowden there. And so that's one reason why it seems like there may be some lies in this story. It's just because that they reprinted this lie that some CIA agent told them.
Right.
So anyways, as a part of they're thinking that Russia was going to smuggle him out. They were planning to ram the car or have the UK engage in firefights with the Russians, either on the streets of London or, this is where it gets kind of really crazy. They talked about shooting out the wheels of a Russian plane as it was about to take off, a Russian diplomatic plane, or using cars to park on the runway, or helicopters to prevent the plane from taking off. And then so all of that sounds completely absurd. Now, there was one part of this that did sound like something the U.S. would do, which is that they were communicating with other allies in Europe to deny Russia airspace to fly over, which is something that has happened in the past and isn't as laughably absurd as all those other ideas. But yeah, that's a lot of it. There was a quote in here, Will, that I think you'll find interesting, where one of the CIA agents says that at one point in 2017, essentially everybody, a sweet streeper, a cop, a shop owner within 3 blocks of the Ecuadorian embassy was somehow a informant or an agent of an intelligence agency, whether it was the U.S., Russia, Ecuador, or something else.
I guess I believe that, yeah.
So I think that about kind of covers the highlights of this story, Will. And again, I'm not telling people that all this is true, even though it kind of sounds like to all of us a real indictment of the intelligence community if they were planning to do that. I mean, this is, a journalist who is a citizen of Australia in a third nation's embassy on UK soil, and they're talking about assassinating him. I mean, this is more serious by orders of magnitude than what the U.S. alleges that the Russians did without proof to Sergei Skripal in the UK, right? Yeah. This is a citizen of an allied country. And there's
imagine if we found documents in Russian, laying out plans for how they were gonna, take out Alexei Navalny. Like how big of a story that would be. Like if it were just the vice versa, the
right,
switch the roles.
And one thing that John Kiriakou pointed out that I guess kind of does maybe throw some cold water on how far this planning got is he says that at one point after the war on terror started that they captured a Australian who had, converted to Islam and actually not out of torture, but pledged his loyalty to Osama bin Laden, right? So this isn't just some guy. This is, somebody who is at least serious about, violent jihad, right? And he says that the U.S. wasn't able to rendition and extradite him and just torture him. They actually had to send him back to Australia. And so I don't know what that means. Maybe in the 10 years, the CIA has gotten that much more out of control with who they're willing to assassinate, or maybe it means that this story is kind of sensationalized. And that's really what I just wanted to like talk about and really bring up the nuance of, because again, I'm seeing a lot of people in the mainstream, or not, excuse me, the mainstream, but the independent media really amplify this story and like say, see, this proves a whole bunch of things. And while I will say, well, there is a lot of confirmation of things that have already been reported in the independent media, whether at the Gray Zone or through different Spanish outlets. I forget exactly what the name of the one that's done a lot of the reporting on the UC
El
Global.
Pais.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I knew you were going to save me on that, Will. Anyways, with all of that, yeah, that a lot of this has already been reported, maybe minus the most sensational of claims, but right. That it is reported by Michael Iskoff, that it is said on record, even by unnamed or some alternatively named CIA officials. It does, for me, give me some more confidence that the UC Global stuff is true, and that at least at like higher ranks of the CIA they kicked around these ideas. Well, anything to bring it? I got more to say, but I'll let you jump if you have anything.
I do have just one point of clarification. So, like you mentioned the Spanish security firm that was hired to do security at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, UC Global, and there had been previous reporting that they had talked about possibly kidnapping and or poisoning Julian Assange. And what Isikoff and others are reporting here, this is distinct from that, right? You're saying the CIA had separate plans.
I'm not sure.
Because
it's not
one thing
clear.
I was going to say is UC Global apparently had been working on behalf of the CIA the entire time. So that's why I was curious.
It's not clear in the article, and that's why my take on it is that those probably are the same plans, and that's probably what the CIA was talking about, and why I have like been trying to say I think that a lot of the story isn't actually new. You know what I mean? Because we've had this reported in the past, again, by some Spanish or independent media outlets. Now there are some real questions here, one being who knew, and so were members of Congress informed about, as far as assuming that this did get kicked around the CIA, who knew is important, and right. What President, Congress, what members of Congress, and then let's see, there was another question that I had. Another important point. Towards the end of this story, they talk about the CIA adopting WikiLeaks-like tactics, and there's like some real misinformation in here. But basically what the CIA is doing, I guess, is like hacking Russian or Chinese firms and then putting that information out online to be decrypted and then published by other people, right? So they're calling this like what WikiLeaks does, although it seems orders of magnitude more nefarious when this is like being done by the CIA, and it seems to be to intentionally smear it. Now there's gonna be a great article out on Monday at antiwar.com by Ray McGovern, and one of the things that he really mentions is there's a lot of Russiagate that is just asserted as flat fact in this article, that the DNC emails were hacked, even though we know that CrowdStrike, that the only organization to investigate it, knows it wasn't true. The CIA says, they just report in here that the DNC emails were hacked, and then like the Snowden in Russia, the WikiLeaks ties to Russia, all of that is definitely in this article, and so it's definitely worth wondering if this is maybe a deep state response to like the Mart Sussman indictment or something like that. But it's definitely an interesting story. It's definitely worth a read. It will take you some time, but read it with a very skeptical eye. And I think that's all I have on it, Will.
Man, I think you did it. Like, thank you for breaking it down like that. Like you're saying, a lot of people had probably been passing this around in alternative media, making big claims with it. But I appreciate your willingness to kind of like pick it apart and be skeptical, and not just take it at face value, just because it seems to maybe verify certain things that we thought were true before. So I appreciate your nuance on that.
Yeah. Well, as much as I like to take credit, I read it, and then I read a tweet from Ray McGovern saying, like, hey, they just assert the DNC email thing is flat bad. So what do you think the rest of the article is like? And then you go back and read it again, and it's
You're
a
like,
different
yeah.
experience. But, let's move on and talk about Congress here, where our Congress just voted to give away a lot of money. But maybe the most offensive vote wasn't the, massive NDAA that just passed the House of Representatives, but the vote to give $1 billion to Israel to fund the Iron Dome. So let's break this down, Will.
Yeah, sure, sure. So, people who watch this show definitely will recall that back in May, there was a big flare up in fighting in Gaza, where there were a lot of rockets being fired into Israel, a lot of airstrikes being carried out in Gaza. The death toll was very disproportionate on the Palestinian side. However, throughout all that fighting, it kind of depleted, apparently, the Iron Dome system. It used a lot of the interceptor missiles that thing uses. And so the House now, I think on Thursday, just passed this bill that basically, as you said, sets aside $1 billion for Israel to help to replenish the Iron Dome. Um, so, almost immediately after the flare up in Gaza in May, there were demands from lawmakers that we should pass some kind of bill to pay to restock their supply. And now, yes, that bill has now in effect passed in the House. I don't think its companion has yet passed in the Senate, however. So this is just a thing that's passed in Congress so far. Of course, it's not clear at all why this is necessary. We already give Israel between $3 to $5 billion in aid every single year, a lot of which is devoted to their military as it is. But I guess we have to give them another $1 billion for this. It just seems a little excessive and unnecessary, as if the Israelis like can't afford this stuff on their own, and there's some third world country or
So,
something.
Will, just real quick, because somebody asked on Twitter, and I think they were sincerely asking, is Israel doesn't need this money, right? So why even ask for it? What do you have? I have like a like kind of my idea, but I was wondering if you had any idea on our, an idea of why it might be.
I mean, I just assume it's the general trend within American politics. There's like, especially within the Republican Party, like I believe Tom Cotton was one of the first senators to float the idea that we should replenish the Iron Dome system. So I just took it as being just a big sop to Israel, as is it's so many other things like the $5 billion in aid we give them is just sort of part of that. I'm curious to hear what your theory might be on that, though.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Basically, it's a political win that our representatives think giving $1 billion of our money away to Israel is going to be good when they could go back home and say that we're defending the great Jews from the terrorists.
Right.
Aren't you so happy about it? And I don't know, maybe it is a political win for a lot of these guys, but it seems like we gotta be getting to the point where like the American first Trumpers are even a little bit tired of some of this stuff. But the thing that I think is maybe a little bit bigger is there's the narrative in the U.S. that Israel is our little brother in the Middle East, and it's the lone democracy in the Middle East, and it's our duty to protect it, and that this is a very easy way to feed into that narrative. I mean, the propaganda hits on every level. This is an Iron Dome, Will. How is an Iron Dome anything but defensive, right? This
Right.
is just because terrorist Muslims just keep firing rockets over the border, and the only thing that the Israelis could do is defend with the Iron Dome, and they needed America to help with that. And so I think that there's like a little bit of a deeper thing there where they really need to ingrain it in American culture that Israel needs the U.S. because it certainly couldn't continue the occupation and the apartheid for long without it.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, like they could certainly afford to replenish their own Iron Dome. However, the reason they need the Iron Dome, in my view, is because to defend themselves against retaliation to the occupation. So, like, if you go out and do a bunch of violent stuff to people, and then you feel the need to protect yourself because from their retaliation, like I don't know, like yeah, that still is technically self-defense, but like if you're out there provoking it in the first place, then maybe it's not exactly that defensive.
And
But
we've
yeah,
made this argument before with like Yemen and stuff like that. I think it's pretty clear that like if you go to your like neighbor's house every day and steal something from him, and then you go to his door and he calls the police, and the police keep telling you to go home and that they'll get your stuff back, but they never bring it back. Like eventually, like that cop is like helping that guy rob you.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All
Yeah,
right.
so like that, you can see that the same way as like continued American funding, even for allegedly defensive things like the Iron Dome. And I mean, with this thing, this is expensive. These missiles are very expensive. The numbers kind of vary depending on whose estimate you're looking at, but for each Tamir interceptor missile that's used by the Iron Dome, I think it's between $20,000 and $100,000 as the price estimate. So basically, your and my yearly salary is just pissed away every single time they use one of these things. It's
And
a lot of money.
how much do you think those rockets cost that Hamas is firing off? Because I
Right.
think almost all of them are unguided. I don't know
Yeah, the
how many
Qassam
guided
rockets.
rockets that they actually fire. It's not very many.
Right, right. But these Tamir interceptors, they're quite expensive, and it's really not clear why the American taxpayer is expected to cover those costs. But nonetheless, we probably will. I expect this will not have much trouble passing in the Senate. However, one thing about this Iron Dome bill, it was initially folded into this bigger spending package. But there was this group of Democrats in the House who had objected to this and said that it should not be part of that bigger bill. And so they did successfully get it pulled out of that to be a standalone thing. And that is what ended up passing on Thursday. However, one of the Democrats who had pushed to remove that Iron Dome bill from the bigger spending thing was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, the New York Democrat who's supposed to be this big progressive. I think she's even referred to herself as a democratic socialist. So, given that, you would think that, she would have voted against the Iron Dome, right? Like, or this bill. Like, if it was so controversial and objectionable that it couldn't be included in the bigger spending package, then surely it's worth voting against, one would think. But actually, no. At the very last minute, AOC decided to change her no vote to a present vote, inexplicably. Present just sort of means it's like neutral. It doesn't go against or for the bill. I don't know. I guess presumably to avoid angering the Israel lobby. Voting no would have itself been symbolic anyway, like a protest vote, because this bill passed by a massive margin. It was like 420 to 9 or something. But the fact that AOC can't even do this, I think just says a lot. I think just like about her, how much does she really care about the Palestinians, despite constantly invoking them and talking about having solidarity and supporting them and all this crap. And she can't even do this like symbolic thing that required just a little bit of courage. It should be noted most other members of the so-called squad, like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, they did vote against this bill, and good on them for that. And I think massively to his credit, Thomas Massie was the sole Republican to vote no on this. So this square Republican from Kentucky is apparently a better ally to the Palestinians and a better progressive than this Democratic Socialist AOC is. So I just thought the whole thing was kind of a farce. However, it got even worse on Friday because then AOC, I actually wrote up an article about this. People, if they're watching the video version, can see that on screen. But on Friday, AOC put out this gigantic 900-word statement trying to explain this last-minute change of her vote. And it was just a disaster. Like, nowhere in this entire gigantic essay does she actually explain why she changed her vote, despite listing all these reasons why this bill was worth opposing. The whole thing was just cringeworthy and embarrassing. I feel embarrassed on her behalf. Like, I occasionally do agree with some of the stuff AOC says. Some of the stuff about police, I think she's right about. The Palestinians, I think she's often right. But at this point, to me, it is pretty clear that she is just a damn Democrat. She does not have principles. All of her rhetoric about solidarity with the Palestinians and with oppressed people, it is purely performative. It is all part of just advancing her career and building this image as being this progressive champion. And I think all of that is really on display with this Iron Dome bill.
Yeah, well, fantastic breakdown of all of this. And I guess one thing worth adding, especially on the AOC piece in particular, is one of the things that happened when Tulsi Gabbard voted president on the first Donald Trump impeachment.
Yep.
AOC went after her and
That's
said
right.
not only was it inappropriate to not vote president on that, but that it was inappropriate to ever vote president on any bill. And she's
Right.
now done it a few times, and I think the last time was on the Capitol police spending bill, in which case her vote would have made a real difference. And where this one was just symbolic, and she should have gotten it right, that one was important, and she got it wrong, in that really really. Is the reason why she's kind of useless. Now again, one of the things about this, Will, that's really important, right, is we saw something in the first on the first go around of this, right? Where if Republicans don't support something and the squad doesn't support something, then it doesn't have enough votes to get passed. And so while there's probably not a whole lot of things the squad and Republicans agree on, because of political reasons, the Republicans are going to oppose various things that the Democrats want. And so it should be very easy for the squad to elicit concessions from the Democratic leadership on issues like this. It's very obvious that particularly AOC is unwilling to do it. One of the things about it, Will, that I'll just point out is that from the footage I watched, before the vote, she's getting a lecture from Nancy Pelosi. And, well, I don't know if it's a lecture. That may be me assuming. But she's talking to Pelosi. And then when she gives the present vote, she's crying. That's right. And how shallow is it that you're going to like not have the courage to do something and then you're gonna like cry about it? Like you know what I mean? Like if you're gonna be a bad person, just be a bad person. Like, don't pretend to actually care. I did actually try to read her letter, and she's talking about how like marginalized communities are pitted against each other, but she's playing into it. But with this vote, it's unbelievable. And but a lot of that letter is almost like the response she gave, I think it was earlier in 2021, but it may have even been a whole year ago now, where somebody asked her about like the two-state solution. She starts going on about the how and the why. Yeah, and dude, the how is really as much important as the what and stuff like this, where a lot of times it goes to show that she's an absolute know-nothing on foreign policy. This should be a pretty easy issue for her. Like, according to her, we're supposed to talk to people in marginalized groups. Well, she is sitting next to Alana Omar, who's a Muslim woman, and Rashid Tlaib, who actually is, I don't think she was born in Palestine, but I think her grandmother lives in Palestine.
Yeah, right? She's Palestinian by heritage, I think. Yeah.
And you should be able to articulate this based on who your apparent friends are, lady. And right. It's just absolutely disappointing. And more than that, it's wrong. And it's one of the reasons why, you won't get anywhere voting for people like AOC. And right. I don't know. Thomas Massey's obviously better than her. Anything else on this particular Iron Dome issue, Will?
No, I literally just wanted to say again, props to Thomas Massey for being the only Republican to vote against this thing. That took some courage, and I think, that's great. I think he did a good job there.
Oh, by the way, I think Jamal Bowman and Ro Khanna were both also voted yes on the Iron Dome bill, which is even worse than what AOC did from more people who should definitely know better. Remember, Bowman replaced Elliot Engel, who was one of the worst Israel hots in the entire House, and Bowman was supposed to be this radical change, and not so much, it turns out.
No. And there was one other Democrat who voted president. I think he actually kind of gave AOC permission to do it. I think his name is Hank Johnson from Georgia, another Democratic rep. He voted president first, and then AOC started crying. It's like, okay, I guess that's what I'll do too.
There's another thing that happened in the House, and that was the NDAA for 2022 passed. That's the National Defense Authorization Act, is the Pentagon funding bill. It's not the entirety of our military funding for the entire year, but it's the bulk of it. This year, the House bill came in at $750 billion, $753 billion, I think, to be exact. There were two very, very important amendments that were voted on last Thursday or Friday. One to do with Syria and one to do with Yemen. The Syria one failed, and that was introduced by Jamal Bowman. So again, this guy should know better and seems to be okay on some foreign policy stuff, but he's not. He put out a really weird tweet about it where he said that the American people should decide what happens in Syria, not that Syrians should decide what happens in Syria, but his actual amendment was worded better, basically, invoking kind of a war power situation to try to get Americans out of Syria. And then, of course, the Ro Khanna one actually calls for the U.S. to end all support for the Saudi war in Yemen. And that one did pass, and that is a part of the NDAA that has passed the House. And so all good news there. And AOC was good on both of those votes. Since we're talking about her so much, I just want to say she was good on those votes.
Good for her, yeah.
Right. But pretty much every mainstream I think 10 Democrats voted against each of those. So, you
Yeah.
know, it wasn't like a radical vote or anything like that.
And,
But
and
on
just real
the
quick
oh,
on
go
the
ahead.
Syria thing, like that is still relevant. Like just last week, I think we bombed Idlib once, so like that is not just like a
And we're
irrelevant issue.
occupying 900 troops, Will.
Yeah,
The most lucrative areas of Syria. And I mean,
that's right.
unfortunately, they're not even talking about what really needs to happen with repealing the sanctions and stuff like that. But
That's
at
right.
least,
Yeah,
you
the
know, this
Caesar
is
Act and all that.
the military action. Now, I do want to talk about AOC one more time here today, Will. And no,
Go
it's
for it.
not her stupid dress, because we don't talk about that shallow shit here. But she did say when voting for the NDAA, again, authorizing $750 billion in defense spending, or war spending.
Yeah,
She says, what we should be doing is sticking to the plan, giving the President of the United States what he determines necessary for defense spending and not a dime more. And so, Will, she is actually saying that the exact right number of defense spending is $750 billion, but the Senate plan to include another 25 billion is just absurd. And this is like the old Tom Woods line where, you know, he'll say, like, they'll have you arguing whether the top tax bracket could be 31 or 35%, but anything else is too radical. I mean, this is just a perfect example of that, I think.
yeah, yeah. Just like never, like you can never cut a single cent. That's just it's unthinkable. How could we even possibly think of that? Now the debate is over how much it should grow. You know, that's always the sort of the parameters of the debate is the rate of growth, not whether we should cut anything.
Yeah, and you know, this is a growing defense budget. Even without the additional spending, this is
Right.
like
Still
a
bigger.
what 3% increase. They want a 5% increase. You know,
Yeah.
this is a woman who's you know, so-called progressive. You know, are any like welfare beneficiaries getting a 3% raise this year, or is it just the military?
That's
And
right.
I think it's just the military. Will, let's. Do you have anything else on Congress?
No, that's pretty much it.
All right, let's move on and talk about your article here about what's going on in Afghanistan. I think the Pentagon finally tried to come up or give us some details on not the drone strike in Kabul, which we have, you know, covered extensively, but the one that happened in Nagahar just a few days before.
Yeah, correct, correct. So yeah, we have devoted quite a bit of coverage to the U.S. drone strike in Kabul that killed 10 civilians, 7 children. The Pentagon had initially tried to deny that. Later, they said, okay, maybe it was 3 civilians, and then ultimately, I think you explained in the show last week, they've now admitted that, okay, yeah, we only killed civilians in this strike, mostly children, zero terrorists, or no ISIS fighters. So that one was on August 29th. And I think that was actually the final American bombing in the country before we fully withdrew. However, a couple days before the Kabul strike, we also launched one in Nangarhar province, further to the east in Afghanistan. And I believe it was in the provincial capital of Jalalabad, but I'm not totally sure about the exact town. I think that's what I had read. And both of these strikes were supposed to be in response to that huge suicide bombing at the Kabul airport earlier in August. And you know, so we've said and heard a lot about that second one in Kabul, but the military had not said too much about that one in Nangarhar since it happened. However, now after nearly a month, CENTCOM has finally come out last week, and they have identified the person that they killed in that strike. I guess maybe they felt compelled to do that, given that the Kabul operation was botched so badly. And of course, they are saying that the guy in Nangarhar was definitely 100% a terrorist and a member of ISIS, and not a little kid and not a civilian aid worker. They're trying to stress very much that he's a bad guy, and they named him as a Kabir Aidi. They said he went by an alias Mustafa, which is boy a very uncommon name in Afghanistan, I'm sure. Mustafa. And they say he was some kind of high-level quote facilitator and quote attack planner, and he was involved in producing IEDs, and they claim that he was part of a so-called threat stream in Kabul, by which I guess they mean that he was supposedly, helping to plan an attack there in the capital. And the CENTCOM statement was kind of weird. It was like it's a weird mixture of like highly specific and very vague. Like they say that he was involved specifically in quote magnetic IED production, but then they can't or won't really explain like how he was tied into the supposed Kabul threat stream, and they give us no evidence whatsoever of how they know that this guy was affiliated with ISIS. And like we should recall that before the Pentagon had to make a total reversal and admit that it actually that other drone strike in Kabul just killed a bunch of innocent civilians and children, they had used a lot of the same verbiage. They said that this guy was an ISIS facilitator, that he visited ISIS safe houses, that he was probably carrying explosives in his car, and that he posed a direct threat to the Kabul airport. That was their story at first, before they admitted that, okay, actually, no, this was actually just a massacre of a random family in a residential neighborhood in Kabul. And even before that, they had tried to come up with some bullshit excuse about how they didn't kill the civilians, but some secondary explosions triggered by bombs in the vehicle. That's what did it. And we now know by their own admission that that whole narrative was false, that there were no secondary blasts. And in my opinion, that was more likely a lie than a mistake. And that the only reason they had to actually admit the Kabul strike was such a failure was because the media in that case actually did its job. And they basically proved that no ISIS fighters were killed in that strike. Like, we talked about that pretty good New York Times investigation that threw cold water on most of their story. So given all that, like, I absolutely do not buy what the military is now saying about this guy that they killed in Nangarhar. Like, I'm not saying it's definitely not true. Maybe he was an ISIS guy, but I'm not going to take CENTCOM's word alone before I believe that. Like, we saw exactly how they came up with a BS story about the one in Kabul and how quickly that could change. And so there's clearly a pretty strong incentive here on behalf of CENTCOM to say at least one of these strikes, was something other than a disaster. These were like our very final acts in the longest war in American history. For those to be botched so badly, I think there's some like symbolism there. So I think the Pentagon really has an interest to say that like one of these was not a failure.
Yeah, that's all great points, Will. And anything else we know about this guy or the attack at all, or is that pretty much all the details we have now? And anybody reporting on this so far?
I haven't seen much subsequent reporting. I did try to look up the guy that they named Kabir Aidi, and I didn't see any obvious hits. So apparently it was not a very high profile, like they used those exact words, say he was high profile, but apparently has not appeared much in English language media. Now, the Pentagon does claim that he was involved in previous attacks. I think they said he tried to attack the university in Kabul last November. But again, they provided no evidence for that. It's purely a claim. So pretty much all we have on this is claims from the Pentagon.
All right. Well, should we move on and wrap up here with our COVID stuff?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
Do you want me to start, or do you got something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I had two things to cover on COVID this week. One, we have been talking a lot about booster shots in the show quite a bit lately. Biden had already made this big announcement where he's saying that all Americans should get a third shot within 8 months of their second dose. They're saying that the vaccines are losing effectiveness. You have to, take a third shot.
And I believe he said it's simple. You get a third shot 8 months after your second. Like that, yes. that is what he said verbatim. Not, maybe it might be a good idea to one day get a third booster shot if you're in a high risk group.
Oh, no, straight up. He said all healthy adults, everyone, universally, everyone should start getting their third doses beginning on September 20th. He even put a hard date on it. And then, yes, also said specifically 8 months after your second dose. That's when you should start getting your third. And I initially found that announcement kind of odd because it came before the FDA had given any formal backing to universal booster shots. I think at the time they had approved them for people with compromised immune systems. But Biden's talking about everybody. And at the time, the FDA and the CDC and the HHS and all the health agencies, they did nonetheless come out with this big joint statement, and they backed Biden's plan. Again, before it got official authorization, they were just saying that, like, yeah, we think this is a good idea. However, as time went on, we started hearing that, maybe there was some skepticism at the FDA and at U.S. health agencies about this whole booster plan. There were two high-level FDA vaccine researchers that, like, suddenly resigned in late August, reportedly over the booster announcement. They thought it was premature. Those researchers later signed, like, an open letter saying that this is not a good idea. And then more recently, like within the last couple of weeks, we were getting reports that the heads even of the FDA and the CDC were kind of telling the White House to like maybe pump the brakes on this whole thing. Like this is moving kind of fast. Well, now this FDA advisory board, they recently met to vote on whether to approve Biden's plan that he already announced ahead of time for booster shots for everybody over the age of 16, and they completely rejected it. The vote was 16-3, like it wasn't even close. And the FDA did end up approving booster shots for people over the age of 65, as well as people in certain other like higher risk categories. But they're saying that they need a lot more data and a lot more time and vetting and stuff before they're going to approve them for everybody, as Biden had already said. I just find this incredible. Like, why would Biden announce this booster rollout before the FDA approved it? And why would he put a hard date on it like that? Like, was he not aware that the FDA, like, of their thinking on this issue? Like, clearly there was a lot of skepticism within the FDA given the spread on that vote, 16-3. And even the head of the FDA herself had put her name on that statement that was supporting this plan, to start boosting people on September 20th. Was she not even aware of her own agency and what it was thinking about this, and that it was not at all ready to approve this? Like, the whole thing to me just makes them look like clowns. It makes it look like they don't know what they're doing. Like, I don't know how else to explain it other than there must have been some kind of major breakdown in communication between the FDA and the White House. Because if the FDA had like informed the White House, hey, we're not ready to approve this, I couldn't see Biden coming out and putting this hard date on it. And sometimes to me, it feels like if there were a deliberate conspiracy to make Americans lose trust in the White House and in their government and in their health agencies, it would look just like this. Like, they would do exactly what they've been doing now. I'm not saying there is such a conspiracy, but just that it would be indistinguishable from what we're seeing right now in reality. So that's basically all I had on boosters. At least for now, the FDA is not going to be administering booster shots to all Americans over the age of 16. That may happen at some point eventually, but the FDA is signaling that it is kind of skeptical about this.
Yeah.
So I did have one other thing, but I'll let you hop in if you had anything to add to that.
No, so I actually had a particular, because I saw Dr. Fauci essentially asked this question, and I thought it was going to be a tough question for him because of how critical he has been of Trump, and this seemed like a place where Biden, for whatever reason, was like kind of out ahead of the FDA. And
right.
And Anthony the Fauci science, right? So this seems to be like, by like, and it's not impossible for Biden to be wrong on, what I mean? Like, in a way, like, fallibility makes people a little bit human. Maybe that's, appealing to Biden for some people, right? Like, he is certainly not a perfect man. Like, nobody can say that about him, right? But anyways, Fauci has asked this, and it says that no, Biden wasn't, and basically says that the president never said what he said, and it doesn't get pushback from the reporter, of course, but that basically this is a prioritizing of who gets the boosters, which I didn't get any of from the FDA, although he did seem to suggest that like a part of it was data and they're just waiting on data. But it also sounded like maybe, Will, that maybe this is me reading between the lines too much. This is just, my opinion, but it kind of almost sounded like he was saying maybe they didn't have enough supply and that's why they're doing it this way. But for whatever reason, he seems confident that one, everybody will get boosters, and two, Biden didn't misspeak, which seems kind of impossible with the current reality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, people can go and look. I did a big thread on when Biden initially announced the booster thing. He put a hard date on it, and definitely, it was like, I don't know, pretty set in stone. It's pretty hard to deny that after the fact.
Yeah. So, Will, anything else on COVID?
Yeah, I did. I had this one other thing I wanted to talk about. There's this new study, and it relates to the sort of metrics and statistics that everyone uses to track the pandemic and sort of look at the trends and all that. And the three basic ones that people usually talk about are cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. And I think we've talked about on the show about how cases alone aren't very helpful as a metric. Like, a case really just means a positive PCR test. But it doesn't tell you anything about how sick somebody is. It doesn't tell you how likely they are to spread the virus. Not to mention, there's been a lot of reporting, even from places like the New York Times. Like, I'm not talking about some fringe, conspiracy theory source, but even the Times has reported about how a huge number of the polymerase chain reaction tests, which look for like the genetic material of the virus, how they they're using the wrong cycle rate, what they call, and they end up being way too sensitive, and they're giving you like tons of false positives. And the Times even had this report where they looked at data from a couple different states, and they found that up to 90% of the PCR tests were giving you this sort of false positive, like oversensitive result. And so cases really aren't a very good metric.
Well, I've been asking this for a while, and nobody really gives me a straight answer. And I just want to be clear, I'm asking a question looking for a real answer. How do they make sure that, let's say, like, you do get COVID this week, right? You test positive on Friday, and then your symptoms aren't bad, right? So you go in a weekend, you get another test to see, like, maybe a kit did all right. Oh, you test positive again. And then in another week, you do another test, you test positive again. finally, after 3 weeks, you test negative, right? Does that
Yeah.
count as three positive cases or one? And then how do they distinguish, especially when your name is Will Porter?
I'm pretty sure it's the former. They count it as three tests, which is another reason, or excuse me, three cases, which is another reason why cases are such an unreliable metric. Because yeah, a lot of people test and retest and retest and keep doing it. Some people have to do it for their job, and so every time, say, like you said, some guy has COVID, he tests three times while he still has the virus, and he's still positive all three times, and that's going to be counted as three separate infections in the case counts. And so again, this is, adding up a bunch of bad data. Like, it's not going to, relying on those numbers is not really going to be good to guide your policy decisions. And so for those reasons and others, hospitalizations and deaths have always been considered better metrics to go by, because at least then they're capturing some like severity of the illness. However, that is where this new study comes in. These researchers in Boston tried to break down the hospitalization data into sort of like more detailed categories to understand it better. And they found that pretty much all along, since March 2020, which is about when COVID hit in the United States, huge numbers of people being hospitalized, supposedly for COVID, were actually admitted for an entirely different reason. Or they were only diagnosed with COVID after they arrived and they showed no symptoms. Like, that's not why they went to the hospital. So between March 2020, when COVID basically hit in the US, and January of this year, that number was 36%. 36% of people who were counted in the hospitalized with COVID category were there for either other reasons or they had no discernible symptoms. However, more recently, between January and June, that trend has become even more pronounced, where now nearly half, or 48%, of all COVID hospitalizations aren't really there for COVID at all. Like, typically, you would think, when you think of a COVID hospitalization, you imagine somebody who is very sick from the virus, who is in the hospital because of the virus.
Right.
But that is not the case at all. Like, so all along, we've been looking at these numbers as if they tell us something meaningful, as if they tell us like who is sick and how sick people are. But really, it's been very misleading because these numbers get skewed given, all the things that I just explained.
Also,
Now,
even if it is just like, even if you go into the hospital, like you break your leg, go to the hospital, and then get COVID in the hospital, that seems pretty different than a community infection, right? So even if you're in the hospital with a serious case of COVID, if you didn't show up there because of COVID, it seems like, that just would be important information for people to be able to have. Also, I'm just curious. So, like, let's say, with it, as concerned as everybody is about COVID, somebody goes to the hospital with COVID because they have COVID, but they're not like in anywhere near a state where they need to be hospitalized, right?
Right.
But at the I mean, there's plenty of, like, this happens. Like, I'm sure I've gone to the hospital before, like when I had a serious case of the flu and I didn't really, I probably didn't actually need to be there or whatever, like that. Like, that happens. And so does that count as a hospitalization, or if people are like not admitted, that's not on the numbers?
I'm not totally sure how they're categorizing all that stuff. However,
Okay.
another thing I wanted to point out about like the ICU numbers, like, because that's another metric that people look at that might actually be a little more helpful, because now we're getting into severity of illness, and like, if you're
Yeah.
in the intensive care unit, that is, I don't know, a pretty strong indicator. However, even there, you still have a similar factor. Why are they in the ICU? Were they diagnosed with COVID after and they showed up with some other symptoms? And then, of course, there's a similar kind of like consideration with deaths as well, like determining whether somebody merely died with COVID from some other cause or whether COVID itself was the cause. Because like the death tallies, I don't think account for that either. And there have actually been some rare cases that end up in media where like a guy literally dies from a gunshot wound, but because he had previously tested positive for COVID, he's added to the COVID death count. And like there have been cases where like the health officials say, oh no, we've revised the numbers, that was a mistake. But like, I'm curious just how much that is happening, how many people are dying from completely other causes, but because they had previously tested positive for COVID, they're being counted as a COVID fatality. And if there is similar research into that, I have not come across it, but I would be very curious to see like, a breakdown, like the way that these Boston researchers broke down the hospitalization numbers. I would like to see that also deaths.
I've seen some people that have put forward it but not anything that you could share officially on Twitter. You know what I mean? Like, it hasn't
Right.
come from like the Atlantic or the Washington Post, unfortunately, and that's essentially what you need to have like a natural conversation about this. If it's from, like even like people do good data analysis on like Medium or I don't want to
Yeah.
say some of the other names because I feel like it'll get the show in trouble. But like just because like even websites are on sometimes doesn't mean like you can't like they don't produce good data that yourself could read and interpret and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
so, but at the same time, you really can't talk about it or share it like on any of our official sites or where most people have their conversations, especially now that you really can't do things in public.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, fortunately with this study, this write-up, it did come from the Atlantic. So like there you go. Like, eat your heart out, people. It's not Alex Jones, it's not InfoWars, like this is a respectable quote unquote publication. So
yep.
people should, I would encourage them to check out that Atlantic piece about the COVID hospitalizations. I think they say hospitalizations can be misleading or something. It's the headline.
All right. Will, anything else? Anything else?
Oh, Uh,
Will, anything else?
nope, that's it, man.
All
That's all I
right.
have.
Well, that's a good time to wrap it up. I don't even have to bother editing it if it's just the end of the show. All right,
Yeah, it's true.
everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll be back with more shows this week. Conflicts of Interest is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Post the video versions at YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. Social media accounts at Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. Will is at the Will Porter. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _. Donate to the show. The information's in the show notes pages. Will, thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye, comrades.